The morning sun pierced through the dense fog surrounding Fort Crimson Ridge like a searchlight cutting through smoke, illuminating the razor wire that crowned the perimeter fence. Staff Sergeant Elena Ghost Martinez stood at perfect attention in the third row of formation, her breath barely visible in the frigid mountain air. 27 years old with dark eyes that had seen too much and a spine that had never learned to bend, she'd earned her nickname not from stealth operations, but from her ability to remain invisible when survival demanded it. Before continuing this story, please comment below with your city or country where you're watching from. Your feedback inspires us to do better. Earlier that morning, Elena had quietly slipped money into the locker of Private Jenny Walsh, an 18-year-old recruit whose family couldn't afford to send care packages. She'd also left a protein bar with a note reading, "You're stronger than you know," for Private Marcus Kim, who'd been struggling to meet the physical requirements and was close to washing out. These small acts of kindness had become Elena's ritual, invisible gestures of support in an environment designed to crush spirits rather than build them. But kindness, as Elena had learned through 4 tours of combat and 6 months at Crimson Ridge, was often seen as weakness by predators who confused brutality with leadership. Colonel Nathaniel Iron Fist Blackwood moved down the line of recruits with the measured pace of a shark circling wounded prey. His boots struck the concrete with metronomic precision, each step echoing off the surrounding buildings like gunshots. The base had fallen silent except for those footsteps and the occasional nervous swallow from newer recruits who hadn't yet learned that showing fear only made things worse. Blackwood's inspection rituals were legendary at Fort Crimson Ridge, and not in ways that inspired pride or patriotism. "Pathetic," he muttered, stopping before a young private whose hands trembled slightly. "You call that a proper stance, Henderson?" "No, sir." "I mean, yes, sir," the private stammered, his voice cracking under the weight of Blackwood's stare. The colonel's weathered face twisted into something between a smile and a snarl, an expression that had terrorized recruits for the better part of 15 years. "Which is it, soldier?" Before Henderson could answer, Blackwood had already moved on, his attention now fixed on Elena with the predatory focus of someone who'd identified his next victim. He paused, eyes narrowing as they traced the combat badges on her uniform, decorations that told stories of valor in places most people couldn't pronounce. Something about her composure seemed to irritate him instantly, the way her stillness suggested an inner strength that his psychological warfare couldn't penetrate. "Well, well," Blackwood said, circling her like a buzzard around roadkill. "Sergeant Martinez, our decorated transfer. Quite the collection of ribbons you've got there." Elena kept her gaze fixed forward, her voice level and professional. "Yes, sir." "You know what we call these at Crimson Ridge?" He flicked one of her combat badges with his finger, the sound sharp as a slap. "Participation trophies. Especially for female soldiers who couldn't handle real combat." Several recruits shifted uncomfortably, but no one dared speak. The base had learned through bitter experience that interfering with Blackwood's training methods was a career-ending mistake. Elena remained perfectly still, her expression neutral, which seemed to further agitate the colonel. Her composure was like armor against his psychological assault, and that armor represented everything he despised about soldiers who'd actually seen combat. "You were with Task Force Viper, correct?" Blackwood's voice carried across the yard with theatrical menace. "Operation Desert Storm." A flash of genuine emotion crossed Elena's face, so brief that only those looking closely would notice. Behind her eyes, fragments of memory surfaced like debris from a shipwreck. Gunfire echoing through narrow streets, desperate radio calls for medical evacuation, the weight of a wounded civilian child in her arms as she carried him to safety while enemy rounds snapped overhead. "Yes, sir," she responded, her voice steady despite the ghosts dancing behind her eyes. "8 good men lost," Blackwood said, emphasizing each word like nails being driven into a coffin. "8 American heroes. And you walked away without a scratch." Lieutenant Daniel Cross approached with a clipboard, his expression uncomfortable. "Sir, we should proceed with the training schedule." Blackwood waved him off without looking, his attention still focused on Elena with laser intensity. "I'm having a conversation with our decorated sergeant, Lieutenant." He leaned closer to Elena, close enough that she could smell the coffee and contempt on his breath. "I read the report. Disobeying direct orders. Should have been court-martialed. Should have been dishonorably discharged. Instead, they transfer you here like some kind of reward. Elena's superior officer had warned her before the transfer. Keep your head down at Crimson Ridge. Blackwood has ended careers for less than perfect shoelaces. He's untouchable. Friends in high places, connections that go all the way to the Pentagon. But Elena hadn't come to Fort Crimson Ridge to keep her head down. She'd come for reasons that ran deeper than career advancement or personal safety. Fallout for tactical training in 15 minutes, Blackwood finally barked at the formation, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never learned the difference between respect and fear. As the recruits dispersed, he pointed at Elena with the theatrical gesture of a Roman emperor condemning gladiators to death. I'll be watching you especially, Sergeant. Very closely. The training facility echoed with shouts and the clatter of equipment as recruits ran through urban combat simulations designed to test their tactical decision-making under pressure. Elena moved with practiced efficiency, outpacing most of her group through the obstacle course with movements that spoke of real experience rather than classroom theory. From an elevated observation platform, Blackwood watched through narrowed eyes as she cleared each section with precision that couldn't be faked or taught, only earned through blood and bullets in places where mistakes meant body bags. She's exceptional, Lieutenant Cross remarked, studying Elena's performance through binoculars. Her tactical awareness is off the charts. She's reckless, Blackwood countered, his voice tight with something that might have been professional jealousy. Watch how she deviates from standard protocol. That kind of improvisation gets people killed. When Elena's team reached the final objective, they encountered unexpected resistance that hadn't been mentioned in the briefing, a deliberate curveball thrown by instructors to test adaptability under pressure. As team leader, she assessed the situation quickly and motioned for her squad to fall back and regroup. "Sir," she called up to Blackwood, her voice carrying clearly across the training ground. "The southwest approach is heavily defended. Request permission to flank from the eastern side." Blackwood's face hardened like concrete setting in the sun. His answer came back sharp as a blade. "Denied." "Proceed as instructed, Sergeant." Elena hesitated for just a moment, long enough for those watching to see the internal calculation she was making. Then she nodded with professional acceptance. "Yes, sir." She turned to her team and directed them forward as ordered, following protocol that she knew would result in failure. The exercise collapsed as simulated casualties mounted, exactly as Elena had predicted when she'd requested permission to adapt their approach. When the buzzer sounded, indicating the end of the drill, Blackwood descended from the platform with a satisfied look on his face, the expression of a man whose predictions had been proven correct, regardless of the cost. "That's why we follow orders here, recruits," he announced to the group, his voice carrying the false wisdom of someone who'd never had to make life-or-death decisions in actual combat. Creativity gets people killed. Protocol saves lives. Elena wiped sweat from her brow, keeping her thoughts to herself while privately calculating how many real soldiers would have died following the colonel's inflexible approach. But when the recruits headed toward the mess hall, Captain Sarah Chen, the base medical officer, fell into step beside her. "You need to transfer out," Chen said quietly, her voice urgent with genuine concern. "I've seen what happens to soldiers who challenge his authority. It never ends well." "I requested this assignment specifically," Elena replied, her tone suggesting depths of purpose that couldn't be easily dismissed. Chen looked at her in disbelief, as if Elena had just announced her intention to juggle live grenades. "Why would anyone voluntarily request Crimson Ridge? This place has the highest suicide rate in the entire army." Before Elena could answer, the mess hall doors swung open and Colonel Blackwood entered with the dramatic timing of a villain in a stage play. The room fell into immediate silence. Conversations died mid-sentence, laughter cut off like severed wires. He walked directly to where Elena sat, holding a manila folder that seemed to radiate threat like a weapon. "I did some digging on your record, Sergeant Martinez," he announced, his voice echoing through the quiet hall with theatrical menace. "Operation Desert Storm. 8 soldiers lost. You were the team leader." Elena's hands tightened around her food tray, but her face remained composed. a mask of professional neutrality that had been forged in firefights and hardened through years of dealing with superior officers who confused rank with wisdom. Tell everyone, Blackwood continued, his voice rising like a conductor building toward a crescendo, how you abandoned your post. How you disobeyed direct orders and got 8 good men killed. The mess hall had become completely still, all eyes on the confrontation like spectators at a gladiatorial combat. Elena stood, intending to leave rather than escalate the situation in front of junior enlisted personnel who didn't deserve to witness this kind of toxic leadership. With respect, sir, she said quietly, her voice carrying the dignity that Blackwood seemed determined to strip away. I need to return to training. Something in her calm response seemed to push Blackwood over the edge. His face flushed dark with anger that had been building for months, and he grabbed her by the collar with the sudden violence of a man who'd lost control of his own narrative. You don't belong here, he hissed, loud enough for everyone to hear. You're not fit to wear that uniform. He began dragging her toward the restrooms with the theatrical brutality of someone performing for an audience. The recruits followed uncertainly, none brave enough to intervene against a senior officer, but all sensing that they were about to witness something that would define their understanding of military leadership. Private Tommy Rodriguez, a 19-year-old recruit positioned at the back of the group, quietly removed his phone from his pocket. His older brother had served under a similar commander and had never recovered from the psychological damage. Tommy understood, with the clarity that comes from personal pain, that some moments needed to be documented. The restroom tiles were cold and sterile, under the harsh fluorescent lights that turned everything the color of institutional despair. Colonel Blackwood shoved Elena forward toward the stalls as stunned recruits crowded the doorway, their faces reflecting the shock of witnessing leadership that had crossed every line of professionalism and human decency. Maybe what you need, Blackwood snarled, his voice echoing off the tiled walls like the sound of breaking glass, is to wash away that insubordination. He forced her toward a toilet, one hand gripping her collar, the other pressing against the back of her neck with the calculated brutality of someone who'd done this before. In the crowd, Tommy Rodriguez raised his phone, recording discreetly from between 2 taller recruits. You think your combat experience makes you special? Blackwood's voice carried the poison of years of accumulated resentment. Let's see how special you feel now. With a violent motion that seemed to crystallize everything wrong with his leadership philosophy, he shoved Elena's head down into the toilet water. A collective gasp rose from the watching recruits, the sound of young soldiers having their faith in the system shattered in real time. Lieutenant Cross stood at the doorway, making no move to intervene despite the obvious assault he was witnessing. Underwater, Elena's eyes remained open, not panicked, not struggling, but calculating. She'd survived interrogation by actual enemies in actual war zones. This wasn't torture. It was theater performed by a bully who'd confused cruelty with strength. Blackwood pulled her up after several seconds, water streaming down her face and soaking her uniform collar. Something shifted in Elena's expression, a decision being made with the cold precision of a weapon being armed. In one fluid motion that seemed almost choreographed in its efficiency, Elena executed a counter-move that spoke of training far beyond anything taught at basic infantry schools. She broke his grip, pivoted, and used his own momentum to spin him around. Before anyone could react, she had Blackwood pinned against the wall, her forearm across his chest, her other hand applying pressure to a nerve point that immobilized his right arm. She had him completely neutralized without causing injury, the kind of restraint that required more skill than violence. The room fell into stunned silence broken only by the sound of water dripping from Elena's hair onto the tile floor. Operation Desert Storm, Elena said, her voice calm and clear despite the water still streaming down her face. I disobeyed the order to abandon civilians in a conflict zone. My team volunteered to stay behind. 3 of us made it out alive. So did 37 civilians, mostly children. She released Blackwood and stepped back to attention, water still dripping from her hair like tears shed for all the soldiers who'd suffered under toxic leadership. I accept whatever disciplinary action you deem appropriate, sir. Blackwood's face contorted with rage and humiliation, the expression of a man whose carefully constructed persona had been destroyed in front of his victims. Everyone out, he shouted, straightening his uniform with hands that shook slightly. Now, Cross, get their names. Everyone here is on report. As recruits filed out in stunned silence, Tommy Rodriguez stopped recording and quickly sent the video to multiple contacts with a simple message that would change everything. This needs to be seen. By evening, the auto video had escaped the confines of Fort Crimson Ridge like wildfire jumping a firebreak. It appeared first on military message boards, shared by active-duty personnel who recognized the toxic leadership they'd experienced themselves. Then it spread to Twitter, Instagram, and news sites. The image of the soaking wet female sergeant standing at perfect attention after neutralizing her abusive superior, striking a chord that transcended military circles. Hashtags formed with organic speed. # insubordinate hero. # Blackwood. Shame #. Justice. At Crimson Ridge, # truth in uniform. Captain Chen knocked on Elena's barracks door just after midnight, her tablet glowing with notifications that seemed to multiply by the minute. It's everywhere, she said, showing Elena the screen filled with shares, comments, and news alerts. And it's not just the video. Other soldiers are coming forward about Blackwood. Former recruits, families of soldiers who didn't make it through his training methods. Elena sat on her bunk, still in her uniform though she'd changed into dry clothes hours ago. The weight of unintended consequences was settling on her shoulders like armor she hadn't asked to wear. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen, she said quietly, staring at the tablet screen where her humiliation had become a symbol of resistance. What do you mean? Chen asked, sensing depths to this story that hadn't yet been revealed. Elena reached under her mattress and pulled out a worn folder, the kind that gets passed between people who can't trust official channels. Inside were meticulously documented cases, dates, names, incidents, reports of abuse signed by witnesses who had since been transferred or discharged under suspicious circumstances. 43 suicide attempts under Blackwood's command in the past 4 years, Elena said, opening the folder to reveal a carefully maintained record of institutional failure. 18 successful, 7 more after discharge. She closed the folder with the reverence reserved for graveyards. I've been gathering evidence for 8 months, working with families, with survivors who were afraid to speak up through official channels. Chen stared at her with new understanding, seeing not just a soldier who'd been humiliated, but an investigator who'd been systematically building a case against systematic abuse. That's why you requested the transfer, Chen said, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. You were investigating him. The system protected him, Elena replied, her voice carrying the bitter weight of experience. Every official complaint disappeared into bureaucratic black holes. Witnesses were transferred to other bases before they could testify. Medical records were reclassified. Blackwood had friends in high places who made sure nothing stuck. She looked at the folder that represented months of careful work, interviews with broken soldiers, documentation of patterns that painted a clear picture of institutionalized abuse. I needed to be here to document it properly, to gather evidence that couldn't be dismissed or buried. You never expected him to humiliate you publicly? No, Elena admitted, a slight smile touching her lips despite everything. But maybe it was the only way the truth would finally come out. Sometimes the system only responds to public pressure. In the base commander's office, General Patricia Winters watched the viral video for the 4th time, her expression unreadable as a professional poker player's. On another screen, news reports played silently. Headlines about systemic abuse at Fort Crimson Ridge scrolling across the bottom like a digital indictment. Get me Sergeant Martinez, she finally said to her aide, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned to make hard decisions quickly. And contact Captain Chen. I want them both here first thing tomorrow morning. Morning light streamed through the windows of General Winters' office, catching dust motes in the air like suspended judgment. Elena stood at attention before the commander's desk, dressed in her formal uniform, prepared for whatever consequences would follow her actions. Captain Chen stood slightly behind her, a witness to proceedings that could end Elena's military career or mark the beginning of something much larger. General Winters studied them both before speaking, her words measured with the precision of someone who understood that everything she said would likely be scrutinized by investigators and journalists. Sergeant Martinez, you understand you're facing serious charges? Assaulting a superior officer at minimum. Yes, ma'am, Elena replied without hesitation, accepting responsibility for actions she'd take again under the same circumstances. Winters tapped her tablet, and the now infamous video played once more. Elena standing at attention with water dripping from her hair, maintaining dignity in the face of deliberate humiliation. Did you know you were being recorded, Sergeant? No, ma'am. Did you plan this confrontation? Elena paused before answering, choosing her words with the care of someone who understood their importance. I requested transfer here to document a pattern of abuse, ma'am. Not to create a confrontation, but to gather evidence that couldn't be ignored or suppressed. Winters nodded slightly, then opened a drawer and removed the folder Elena had shown Chen the previous night. This was delivered to my office early this morning, the general said, opening it and spreading out some of the documents like evidence in a trial. 43 suicide attempts, 18 deaths, dozens of cases of documented psychological abuse spanning 4 years. Captain Chen stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd treated the casualties of toxic leadership for too long. I've been treating the aftermath for years, General. My reports were consistently ignored, reclassified, or buried by people who seemed more interested in protecting the institution than the soldiers within it. You could have brought this directly to me, Winters said, looking at Elena with something that might have been respect. Previous reports were buried, ma'am, Elena replied, her voice carrying the weight of bitter experience. I needed irrefutable evidence, something that couldn't be denied, dismissed, or classified out of existence. The general studied her for a long moment, then pressed a button on her desk intercom. Send them in. The door opened, admitting a group of people that represented the human cost of institutional failure. Some in uniform, others in civilian clothes, family members holding photographs of loved ones who hadn't survived Blackwoods. Training methods. Former recruits with haunted eyes that spoke of psychological wounds that might never heal. Each person represented a story of systematic psychological torture disguised as military discipline. These people have been outside my office since dawn, Winters said, her voice heavy with the weight of accumulated evidence, each with a story to tell. One woman stepped forward, clutching a framed photograph of a young soldier whose smile suggested he'd once believed in the nobility of military service. My son, Private First Class David Santos, she said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. He served under Colonel Blackwood last year. He took his own life 3 months after leaving Fort Crimson Ridge. Others began to speak, sharing similar stories that painted a clear picture of leadership that had confused brutality with training, sadism with strength, careers destroyed, lives damaged, voices silenced by a system that valued order over justice. Winters raised a hand, gently stopping the testimonies before they could overwhelm the room with grief. Colonel Blackwood has been relieved of command pending investigation, she announced, her words carrying the finality of long overdue justice. She turned back to Elena, her expression complex with competing emotions, respect for courage, anger at institutional failure, and the weight of command decisions that could never be made lightly. This doesn't excuse your actions, Sergeant Martinez, but context matters. Captain Chen has provided medical evidence corroborating these accounts, and this investigation is expanding beyond Fort Crimson Ridge. Elena remained at attention, but her eyes moved across the faces of those who had come forward, people who had found their voices because someone else had found the courage to act. What happens now, ma'am? The investigation is expanding to other bases where similar patterns have emerged, Winters replied, opening a new folder that suggested the scope of the problem was larger than anyone had imagined. As for you, Sergeant, technically you're being reassigned pending review. I understand, ma'am. However, Winters continued, there will also be a commendation. The Soldier's Medal for your actions during Operation Desert Storm, which has been reevaluated in light of new testimony from the civilians you saved. Elena blinked, the only sign of surprise she allowed herself to show. I don't understand, ma'am. We've received statements from the surviving civilians, Winters explained, her voice softening slightly. They confirmed that without your team's decision to stay behind when ordered to withdraw, they would have been massacred. The children you saved are adults now, with children of their own. The general's expression carried the weight of recognition long overdue. Sometimes orders are wrong, Sergeant. The hard part is knowing when. The harder part is having the courage to do what's right anyway. As the meeting concluded, Lieutenant Cross was waiting outside the office, his usual swagger replaced by uncertainty and something that looked like shame. He stood straighter when Elena emerged, as if trying to project an authority he no longer felt entitled to claim. "Sergeant Martinez," he said, his voice lacking its previous confidence. "A moment, please." Captain Chen glanced between them. "I'll meet you at the medical center," she said to Elena before walking away. Cross shifted uncomfortably once they were alone, struggling with words that didn't want to be spoken. "The recruits want to know if you'll be returning to training duties," he said finally. "That's not my decision, Lieutenant." "I've served under Blackwood for 3 years," Cross said suddenly, the words coming out like a confession that had been building pressure for too long. "I saw things, did nothing. Worse than nothing, I enabled him. I helped create an environment where good soldiers were broken for entertainment." Elena studied him, seeing the conflict behind his eyes, the war between loyalty to authority and loyalty to principle that had been won by the wrong side for too long. "We all make choices," she said simply. "I'd like to make different ones now," Cross replied, extending a data pad toward her. "The recruits drafted new training protocols based on your suggestions during yesterday's exercise. They're requesting your input on implementation." Elena took the pad, surprised by the gesture and what it represented. "I'm not in command here." "No," Cross agreed, "but you have something more valuable than rank. You have respect earned through competence and integrity. Something Blackwood never understood, something I'm only beginning to learn." He looked down at his boots, the gesture of a man confronting his own failures. "Respect can't be demanded. It can only be earned through actions that prove you deserve it." Outside the administrative building, a small group of reporters had gathered at the base entrance like carrion birds, attracted by the scent of scandal. News of Blackwood's removal had spread beyond the viral video, attracting media attention that transformed a military personnel issue into a national conversation about leadership and accountability. "There's a back exit," Cross offered, gesturing toward a less visible route. "No," Elena replied, her voice carrying quiet determination. "No more hiding. No more letting toxic leaders operate in shadows while good soldiers suffer in silence." She walked toward the main gate, aware of cameras turning in her direction like weapons seeking targets. The reporters pressed forward, microphones extended like spears in an ancient phalanx. "Sergeant Martinez, can you comment on the allegations against Colonel Blackwood?" called a reporter from a major news network. Elena stopped, weighing her words with the careful precision of someone who understood their potential impact. "The military is investigating serious concerns about leadership failures and institutional culture," she said. "I trust in that process and in the courage of soldiers who are finally finding their voices." Another reporter called out, "The video shows you defending yourself after being assaulted. Do you consider yourself a whistleblower?" "I consider myself a soldier," Elena replied, her voice carrying the authority of earned experience. "One who believes in protecting those who cannot protect themselves, whether from external enemies or internal ones." A third reporter pushed forward. "Was this an isolated incident or indicative of systemic problems within military leadership?" Elena was about to answer when General Winters appeared behind her presence commanding immediate attention and respect. "This is now an official military investigation," Winters stated firmly, her voice cutting through the chaos with practiced authority. "There will be a formal briefing tomorrow. Until then, no further comments will be made." The reporters reluctantly backed away as Elena and the general walked toward the barracks area, their questions hanging in the air like smoke from a battlefield. "Thank you, ma'am," Elena said quietly. "Don't thank me yet, Sergeant," Winters replied, her expression grave with knowledge of battles yet to be fought. "The real storm is just beginning. There are powerful people who supported Blackwood's methods, who believe that military discipline requires psychological brutality. They won't surrender without a fight. I'm not afraid of a fight, General, Elena said with quiet confidence. Winters gave her a measured look that carried years of experience with institutional warfare. I know, she said. That's what worries me. The people we're dealing with don't fight fair, don't respect rules of engagement, and don't care about collateral damage. Throughout the following days, more evidence emerged like water breaking through a cracked dam. Captain Chen released anonymized medical records showing patterns of injuries consistent with physical and psychological abuse. Former recruits came forward with testimonies of psychological torment disguised as training. Families shared stories of sons and daughters who had never recovered from their experiences under Blackwood's command. The viral video had cracked open something that had been festering in darkness for years, and now the full scope of institutional failure was pouring into public view. Elena spent her days reviewing training protocols with Cross, who seemed determined to make amends by implementing reforms that prioritize soldier welfare over sadistic traditions. In the evenings, she met with General Winters, providing detailed accounts for the official investigation that was expanding to encompass multiple bases and years of systematic abuse. 1 week after the incident, Elena sat alone in the mess hall when Private Rodriguez approached her table, his expression nervous but determined. "May I join you, Sergeant?" he asked. She nodded, and he sat down with the careful movements of someone approaching a conversation that might change his life. "I wanted to apologize," he said, his voice low and serious, "for recording you without permission. It wasn't meant to go public like that, to become this huge thing." "But you sent it to multiple people," Elena pointed out, not accusing but observing. Rodriguez looked down at his tray, gathering courage for words that needed to be spoken. "My older brother served under Blackwood 3 years ago," he said finally. "He was one of the ones who attempted suicide. He survived, but he's never been the same. The Army labeled it a training accident, but we knew better." He looked up at Elena, his eyes bright with the pain of watching someone he loved slowly destroyed by institutional indifference. "When I saw what the colonel did to you and how you stood up to him with such dignity, I thought maybe it could finally make a difference. Maybe other soldiers wouldn't have to suffer the way my brother did." Elena was silent for a moment, processing the weight of unintended consequences and their potential for good. "It has made a difference," she said finally. "But changes like this come with costs that extend far beyond the people who initiate them. Worth it though, right?" Before she could answer, her tablet chimed with an incoming message from General Winters, requesting her immediate presence. The tone suggested urgency that couldn't wait for convenient timing. Elena found the general in the communications room, surrounded by monitors displaying news feeds from multiple networks. Each screen showed variations of the same story. Congressional hearings demanded, military reform initiatives proposed, Fort Crimson Ridge as the focal point of a national conversation about military culture and accountability. "It's gone national," Winters said without preamble, gesturing toward the screens like a general surveying a battlefield. "The Secretary of Defense is flying in tomorrow. There's talk of congressional hearings, Inspector General investigations, systematic reviews of training protocols across all branches." The room hummed with electronic activity, phones ringing, printers churning out reports, the digital machinery of institutional crisis management operating at full capacity. "I never intended to cause this level of disruption, ma'am," Elena said, though her voice carried no regret for actions she'd take again under the same circumstances. Winters turned to face her, her expression complex with competing emotions. "You intended to expose the truth, Sergeant. Once that happens, the consequences develop their own momentum. Truth has a way of spreading like wildfire, especially when it's been suppressed for too long." That night, unable to sleep under the weight of national attention and institutional upheaval, Elena found herself walking the perimeter fence that surrounded Fort Crimson Ridge. The same fog that had shrouded the base on her first morning had returned, softening the harsh outlines of buildings and training grounds with merciful concealment. She stopped at a bench overlooking the parade ground, surprised to find Captain Chen already seated there, staring out at the mist-covered terrain. "Couldn't sleep either?" Chen asked, making room on the bench. Elena sat down, grateful for company that didn't require explanations or justifications. Too much happening, she admitted. Too many variables beyond my control. You've started something bigger than any of us anticipated, Chen said, her voice carrying a mixture of admiration and concern. I've received calls from medical officers at 7 other bases. They're coming forward with similar reports, similar patterns of abuse that have been ignored for years. Elena stared out at the fog-shrouded training ground where so many soldiers had been broken in the name of discipline. I only wanted to stop Blackwood, she said quietly, to gather enough evidence that he couldn't hurt anyone else. Chen smiled slightly, the expression of someone who'd seen institutional change happen in unexpected ways. That's the thing about courage, Sergeant. It's contagious. When one person stands up, others find the strength to do the same. Your video didn't just expose one toxic commander. It gave voice to soldiers who thought they'd never be heard. The following morning brought clear skies and the arrival of the Secretary of Defense's helicopter, its rotors cutting through the mountain air with mechanical precision. Elena stood with General Winters, Captain Chen, and Lieutenant Cross as part of the welcoming committee, aware that this moment would likely define the trajectory of military reform for years to come. As the Secretary's entourage approached, Elena was surprised to see Colonel Patricia Hayes, her former commanding officer from Task Force Viper, among the group. Hayes had been the officer who'd supported Elena's decision to disobey orders and save civilian lives, support that had likely cost her own career advancement. Sergeant Martinez, Hayes said, approaching with a salute that carried genuine respect. It seems you're still fighting the good fight, even when it puts you at personal risk. Ma'am, I didn't expect to see you here, Elena replied, returning the salute with parade ground precision. The Secretary wanted a comprehensive review of your military record, Hayes explained, her voice carrying undertones of significance. That includes a re-evaluation of Operation Desert Storm and the circumstances surrounding your team's decision to protect civilian lives. She lowered her voice so only Elena could hear. Your team's sacrifice saved 37 people, Sergeant. It's time that sacrifice was properly acknowledged instead of buried in classified files. The Secretary of Defense approached, extending his hand to General Winters before turning his attention to Elena. His expression was grave with the weight of institutional failure and the knowledge that reform would require confronting powerful interests invested in maintaining the status quo. Sergeant Martinez, I've reviewed your file extensively, he said, his voice carrying the authority of his office. What happened here represents a serious failure of leadership, not yours, but at multiple levels that allowed this situation to develop and persist. Elena stood at attention, aware that her response would likely be analyzed and quoted by people far more powerful than anyone present. Yes, sir, she replied simply. There will be a formal hearing next week in Washington, the Secretary continued. Congressional oversight, Inspector General review, systematic examination of training protocols and leadership accountability. I'll need you there, along with Captain Chen and anyone else with first-hand knowledge of these issues. We'll be there, mister. Secretary, General Winters assured him, speaking for the institutional commitment that Elena's actions had forced into existence. As they moved toward the administration building for the official briefing, Elena noticed a crowd had gathered near the base entrance. Not reporters this time, but civilians, families of soldiers who had suffered under Blackwood's command, standing in silent support like witnesses to a long-overdue reckoning. Among them, she recognized Mrs. Santos, the mother of Private First Class. David Santos, holding her son's photograph with the quiet dignity of grief, transformed into purpose. The woman nodded to Elena, a gesture of gratitude that said more than any speech about the power of one person's courage to validate another's loss. Elena returned the nod, feeling the weight of responsibility settle more firmly on her shoulders. This was no longer about one colonel or one base or even one branch of the military. It had become a reckoning with institutional culture that had confused brutality with strength, sadism with discipline, fear with respect. 1 month later, Elena walked among the white headstones of Arlington National Cemetery, her dress uniform immaculate in the soft morning light that filtered through ancient trees. She stopped before a section containing the graves of her team from Operation Desert Storm. 8 markers representing soldiers who had died so that others might live. She knelt to place a small stone on each grave, a ritual of remembrance that connected past sacrifice with present purpose. "We made the right choice," she said softly to the markers, her voice carrying across the sacred ground. "Those children are adults now, with children of their own. Your sacrifice continues to matter." The sound of footsteps on grass made her turn. General Winters approached, similarly dressed in formal attire, her expression carrying the weight of institutional change that had accelerated beyond anyone's expectations. "The investigation is expanding to 12 bases now," Winters said without preamble, her voice businesslike but carrying undertones of satisfaction. "Similar patterns, systematic issues across multiple installations. And Blackwood is facing court-martial on 17 charges." She stood beside Elena, looking at the graves of soldiers who had died following their conscience rather than their orders. Multiple witnesses are coming forward now that they see institutional support for accountability rather than cover-ups. Elena straightened, processing information that suggested the scope of necessary reform was larger than anyone had initially imagined. And the reforms themselves? Congressional approval for the new oversight protocols, mandatory reporting requirements, independent review boards with civilian participation, Winters replied, listing changes that represented fundamental shifts in military culture. "They're calling it the Desert Storm Protocol, in honor of your team's decision to prioritize civilian lives over institutional convenience." Elena felt a complex mixture of vindication and sorrow, justice for those who had suffered, but at the cost of exposing systematic failures that had persisted for decades. "The medal ceremony is tomorrow," Winters continued. "There will be media attention, public recognition of your actions both past and present." "I didn't do this for medals or recognition," Elena said, echoing words she'd spoken before but meaning them no less for their repetition. "No," Winters agreed. "You did it for them." She gestured toward the graves before them, then toward the broader cemetery that represented generations of military service, and for the soldiers still serving who deserve leadership based on respect rather than fear. The congressional hearing had lasted 4 grueling days, with Elena testifying for nearly 8 hours about the pattern of abuse she'd documented, the systematic cover-ups she'd encountered, and the broader cultural issues that had allowed toxic leadership to flourish unchecked. Captain Chen had presented medical evidence showing psychological trauma patterns consistent with sustained abuse. Former recruits and family members had given emotional testimony about the human cost of leadership that confused brutality with strength. Blackwood himself had appeared on the final day, defiant at first, insisting that his methods produced superior soldiers who could handle the rigors of combat. But when confronted with suicide statistics, medical records, and testimony from soldiers whose lives had been destroyed under his command, his composure had cracked like poorly maintained armor. "War is brutal," he had argued, his voice carrying the desperation of someone whose worldview was collapsing. "Training should prepare soldiers for that brutality, not coddle them with sensitivity and participation trophies." The committee chair, a retired Marine general named Patricia Morrison, had leaned forward with the authority of someone who'd earned her opinions through actual combat experience. "There's a difference, Colonel, between rigorous training that builds character and systematic abuse that destroys human beings. One creates warriors, the other creates casualties before the battle even begins." The hearing had concluded with unanimous recommendations for system-wide reforms. Independent oversight committees, enhanced reporting mechanisms, mandatory psychological evaluations for command positions, and civilian participation in military justice proceedings involving abuse allegations. Now, standing in Arlington among the fallen, Elena felt the weight of institutional change that had begun with one moment of resistance and spread like ripples across the entire military establishment. "The reforms go into effect next month," Winters continued, handing Elena a folder containing new assignment orders. "They're offering you a position at the Pentagon, developing training protocols that prioritize leader development over psychological domination." Elena opened the folder, reading assignment details that would take her from the periphery of military power to its center. an opportunity to shape institutional culture rather than simply document its failures. Why me? She asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Because you've proven something that many people in leadership positions have forgotten, Winters replied. That true authority comes from earning respect through competence and integrity, not demanding obedience through intimidation and fear. She paused, her expression carrying the weight of institutional wisdom earned through years of navigating. Military bureaucracy. The Pentagon needs people who understand the difference between leadership and domination, between discipline and abuse. Your actions have shown that you're someone who can be trusted with that kind of responsibility. As they walked back toward the cemetery entrance, Elena reflected on the journey that had brought her from a combat zone where she'd chosen civilians, over orders to a national stage where she'd chosen justice over career safety. One more thing, Winters said as they reached the parking area. Colonel Hayes specifically requested that you be assigned to her staff. She's heading the new Leadership Development Division. Elena smiled, the first genuine expression of happiness she'd allowed herself in months of institutional warfare. Ma'am, I'd be honored to serve under Colonel Hayes again. Good, because the real work is just beginning. Changing policy is one thing, changing culture is something else entirely. It's going to take years of sustained effort to undo decades of toxic leadership practices. As Elena drove away from Arlington, she thought about the graves she'd visited, the soldiers who had died following their conscience rather than convenient orders. Their sacrifice had given her the foundation to challenge institutional failures, just as her challenge had given other soldiers the courage to speak truth to power.